Some of the greatest lessons that Jesus taught were taught in such a simple way that it really is hard to miss the important points that he makes. One such lesson that Jesus taught is found in John the 10th chapter, as was read in our hearing a moment ago. You recall how that Jesus spoke of himself as the Good Shepherd. And it's very interesting how Jesus uses these figures of speech to explain things that are sometimes a little difficult to understand. Beginning in verse 7 of John chapter 10, Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I'm the door of the sheep. Door of the sheep? Well, you have to get in somehow. He continues and says, All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. And now he explains that. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. You see, Jesus used the image of a door to talk about who's saved and who's not. Jesus said, I am the door through which the sheep must enter in order to be in the safe place in the fold. And so Jesus Christ is telling us that we can only be saved when we pass through him. Later in John the 14th chapter, verse 6, Jesus would tell his apostles, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. By this door, by this entrance in. In Matthew the 7th chapter, Jesus had used the illustration of builders who are building homes. And on that occasion, he would say, Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him unto a wise man who built a house on the rock. And the storms of life came, and it stood, because it was built on my words. And so Jesus, in numerous ways, portrayed the fact that he was the door, he was the way, he was the rock. There is no salvation outside of Jesus Christ. That's very important. But Jesus made it so simple by saying, I am the door. But you'll notice also in these verses, he talks about others who have come, but were not the way. The history of man is filled with religious characters. Some were leaders and some were not. Some established religions and others simply walked among us. But Jesus quickly dismisses all others. And I find that fascinating. That includes Moses and Abraham. That includes David, the prophets of the Old Testament. All others were not the door. All others were not the way to salvation. And all the prophets that have lived, and all the great religious leaders that have lived, all together are not equal to Jesus Christ, who is the door. And those who go in are the saved. Jesus promises that. And then he says of them that they know my voice. They hear my voice. Verse 8. There's only one way to go in to the presence of God through Jesus Christ. And that's through his word. Through his voice. Just as he said there in Matthew 7, Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them is a wise man, and his house will stand. And so the words of Jesus become crucial. The only way Jesus today can be a door is through his teaching. Through his teaching we can find our way into the fold of salvation. But notice in verse 11 next he says, I'm the good shepherd. So he changes images on us. He was a door and now he's a shepherd. Jesus plays both these roles. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. As I thought about that, I grew up on a farm and we had lots of animals and we loved them dearly. I had a pet cow that used to come when I called. She gave milk out of this world. She raised 2 calves a year, and the sale of those calves helped put me through college. Her name was Muley. About forgot. And I remember on one occasion, Muley got sick. She got down in a ditch, and she couldn't get up. And my dad called the veterinarian. He came out. That's when doctors made house calls. And with everything we could do, we couldn't get Muley out of that ditch. We tried pulling her with a tractor and tying her up different ways and trying to get her out. Finally, the veterinarian said, there's one thing I can do. He said, I'm going to give her a shot, and it will cause her to get up from there, or she will die where she lays. Well, I was still a young boy. When I heard that, I ran back to the house and I cried my eyes out. My cow was about to die. But I prayed. I prayed to God in heaven more than I had prayed before ever. I didn't want to lose my cow. Well, the veterinarian gave her the shot. And we stood back and watched. In about 20 minutes, Muley got up on her legs and climbed out of that ditch. That was the first time I remember an answer to prayer that began to change my life. You know, farmers love their animals. They love the ones they care for, they nurture them, they tend to them, and when they get sick, they get them attention. But I don't guess I've ever known a farmer who died for his cow. I've never known a farmer who literally died for his pigs. I've never known a farmer who intentionally went to the cross for his sheep. Have you? Animals aren't as valuable. We don't count them as valuable as human beings. And so we don't normally think of ourselves as suffering death simply so an animal could live. But Jesus did. Jesus is the good shepherd. There aren't any others like him. And he says he wants to give us life. In verse 12 he says, those who are hirelings, who don't own the sheep, they see a wolf coming and immediately they flee. They don't want to get hurt. They don't want to get eaten. They don't want to fight a wolf. And so they flee. But I, he said, am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I'm known of my sheep. I lay down my life for the sheep. You know, I guess you could say, actually, every religious leader who's ever lived thought they were probably doing what was right and probably had good intentions, and we won't question their motives, although I'm sure some of them were not right. But when it came right down to it, would they die for their followers? Probably not. Probably not. They would, as these hirelings, would flee. Buddha, would he die for his followers? Krishna, would he die for his followers? Joseph Smith, would he die for his followers? We could just go on down. But Jesus said, I lay down my life for my sheep. Jesus cares that much. And he cares that much because he loves the sheep. That should never be questioned. For he died for them. And then verse 16 he says, I have other sheep which are not of this fold. This opens the door then for others to become sheep in the Lord's fold. I must bring them, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Oh, you can search the New Testament scriptures from daylight to dark. And you may not find many statements that reflect the idea that the Lord has but one church. But I guarantee you one thing, if you read this verse, there's never doubt. Why not have several different flocks? Why not let Jesus be the shepherd over multiple folds of sheep? Now, you probably know the answer to that. I probably won't have to get into detail. The shepherd brings his sheep together because they know him, he knows them, and they follow his voice. You know, it's an interesting thing. The Greek word for church, ecclesia, means the called out. Called out by who for what? The shepherd's voice, the sheep hear, they come. The church. The saved. The one fold. Earlier, Jesus had talked about the sheep not hearing others' voices. You know, that's what we have in the religious world. We've had it that way for centuries. We've had other voices calling. We've had men who have called this way, and men who have called that way. And it's created division among God's people. Division is sad. In John the 17th chapter, Jesus prayed, Father in heaven, I pray that they may be one as thou art in me and I in thee, that the world may believe thou hast sent me. I pray that they may be one. Anybody who's a Bible student has read that verse has to feel a little uncomfortable. We haven't done a very good job of it. We haven't answered the Lord's Prayer very often. How many times have you heard of separate and independent groups of Christians coming together to form a fold? A number of years ago, I preached for a congregation in Lake Butler, Florida. It was kind of interesting because that congregation hadn't existed very long. There had been 2 churches. And they'd gotten together and discussed their differences and worked out their arrangements, and they had closed one building and moved to one building. One fold. One fold. You know, there are many in the religious world today that believe we need thousands of folds. There are a list of over 3,000 different religious bodies in America, all following some different ideas and some different creeds and some different voices of men. My friends, Jesus' voice, the called out ones, results in one fold. Jesus said there's one fold and there is one shepherd. If you have 2 folds, you need 2 shepherds. Otherwise, the sheep are all confused. Who do they hear? Who do they listen to? And this gives a solution to our problem in the religious world. A number of years ago, I thought some were going to actually achieve something along this line because they had come together, different religious bodies, and had talked about returning to the New Testament. Returning to the voice of Jesus. If there's anything in the world we should be able to unite upon, it has to be His voice. But that effort failed because there were other voices heard. And it never worked. That's sad, isn't it? If we could just tune out all the other sounds, and you and I as Christians just hear the voice of Jesus, how simple that would be. When someone asks us a religious question, if we just had the voice of Jesus in our heads, then we'd have the perfect answer. If whenever there's an argument or discussion about this or that, if we just had the voice of Jesus in our heads, You know, in the church of Corinth, some things were beginning to divide that church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we read where the Apostle Paul writes to them and reminds them that they are hearing different voices. Now, I don't think that the voices they were hearing were divisive voices. What happened at Corinth, there were some who preferred certain speakers to others. And I believe, from what we can read in the Scriptures, that all these speakers were basically preaching the truth. But notice what Paul warns of. In verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 1, he said, I've heard that there are divisions or contentions among you. The sheep are already getting restless. Now this I say, every one of you says, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Peter, and I am of Christ. Isn't that silly? To line up with a human speaker rather than the voice of Jesus. Now we all have our opinions. And we all say things in a different fashion or a different way. That's true even of preachers. And I'm sure if you went to hear Paul preach, you might hear things a little different way than you would hear them if you went to hear Apollos. Apollos is referred to in the book of Acts as an eloquent man, and Paul speaks of his feeble speech. So probably if you like classical oratory, you'd go hear Apollos. But they have the same message. More importantly, they have the same Jesus. They have the same shepherd. But by saying, I prefer these different characters, Paul asked in verse 13, is Jesus divided? Does the shepherd have different flocks going different directions? Does Paul have a church, and Apollos have a church, and Cephas have a church? And then he asked this, was Paul crucified for him? What did Jesus say in John 10? I lay down my life for the sheep. And you know something? I'm not going to follow anybody until they're willing to lay down their life for me. I'm not giving my spiritual, eternal salvation up to somebody who won't lay it all down. I don't care who they are. Jesus is the only good shepherd. Hear ye him, said the Father in heaven. But in Corinth, they were beginning to be divided. Oh, I don't like the way he preaches. I don't like the way he teaches class. I like him better. So what did Paul say? I am afraid of you. Look at verse 10. I beseech you by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, there's the shepherd's voice, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. And that is the only source of religious unity. We all have to agree on a voice. And if that voice is Jesus, then we can agree. And we should always agree. And so going back to John the 10th chapter, Jesus' voice brings the flock together. And he says there are others who are not a part of this flock. Not everybody's in the church. Not everybody is in the fold that's saved. There are some lost ones out there. How are they going to get in? Same way the first group got here. They shall hear my voice. Pretty simple, isn't it? Somebody asks you the plan of salvation. What kind of answer do you give? Obey the Lord. Isn't that it? Hear his voice. Shut out everything else. Go to Jesus. The way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father except by me. And I do mean no man. But Jesus is the good shepherd. As a result, then, there is but one fold. Notice how plainly Jesus says this. Verse 16. Others shall hear my voice, and there shall be, future tense, one fold and one shepherd. Now I remind you that earlier in verse 9, the fold is the saved. Now, put two and two together. The fold is the saved, and there's not but one fold. What does that mean? There's one place for all the saved. You go to the book of Ephesians and you see the same thing by the Apostle Paul. You see there weren't hundreds of churches in the first century. There were not hundreds of folds in the first century. There was only one fold, and they were made up of the same. If you look at the Ephesians letter in chapter 1 and verse 22, God hath put all things under Christ's feet and gave him to be head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him that fills all in all. The church, the body of Christ, only in the singular. And then Ephesians 4 and verse 4. There is but one body and one Spirit, and you're called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. One Lord, one voice, one shepherd, one fold, one faith. What does that tell us? Jesus is the good shepherd, and when the sheep hear his voice and follow him, what does that do? What are the chances of all of us this morning getting together for anything that we all share an interest in? Every one of you here have interests that are very special and unique to you. Some of you like to fish. Some of you like to be a part of a social club. Some of you enjoy certain activities, a chess club. Would we ever meet together, all of us, at any of those? Probably not. I'll be honest with you, a lot of the things that excite people bore me to death. That's why I'm not a member of a lot. But we're here this morning, aren't we? Why? What brings us together? One voice, one shepherd, one body. And that's what we have in common. That's why we can call ourselves brothers and sisters in Christ. Family, part of God's family. Not because of anything we've done, not because of anything we've accomplished, but because of the shepherd. And that's what makes us a part of his fold. See how simple it is when Jesus begins to explain it. It's not complicated. It's not hard to understand. Jesus is the good shepherd. And when I think of that, I'm reminded of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That ought to be all of his sheep saying that. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I don't need another voice. I don't need another shepherd. I don't need another fold. I'm home. And David ended that psalm in a beautiful way, didn't he? He said, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, because this is the Lord's fold, This is where the Lord's voice is heard. This is where the saved sheep are. And if we leave this fold, we lose all that Jesus has done for us. And we're lost. This morning, be sure you're in the fold. Be sure you know the Good Shepherd. Be sure he knows you. Hear his voice and obey him, even as we stand together and as we sing.